What's up YouTube, it's the Casual Air Gunner again, and today I'll be looking into something that people increasingly have to worry about when buying airgun ammo, and that's whether it'll cycle in repeaters or rotary magazines. Back when airguns were mostly single shot, this wasn't as much of an issue, but nowadays a lot of 177 and 22 caliber airguns are repeaters, and it's always a huge disappointment when you buy a case of ammo for your repeating airgun only to find out that it doesn't cycle. So I'll be going over several pellet types and whether or not they will cycle or will not cycle in repeaters. But before I get into that, let's point out that while I'll be using 177 caliber pellets as examples, 22 caliber pellets and magazines are basically scaled up versions of their 177 caliber counterparts. So if the 177 version of the pellet doesn't cycle, chances are the 22 caliber versions don't cycle either. First, let's look at an example of pellets that will cycle in all rotary magazines. Generally, any wadcutter, dome, hollow point, or any of the common pellet shapes that aren't longer than the depth of the magazine will cycle. That's because it's shorter than the depth of the magazine. If you look closely, there's no point where the tip of the pellet extends past the end of the pellet slot. That's why even pointed jacketed pellets like this Skenco blue arrow will still cycle. The pellet's length is the issue, not the shape. The blue arrow is the longest pellet that will cycle in any rotary magazine. You could see when I loaded it, it was basically flush with the ends of the magazine. So that means if it was any longer at all, it would no longer be able to cycle and the gun would jam. To demonstrate that these will all cycle, I'll take this loaded rotary magazine with all the pellets I just showed and load it into my CO2 pellet pistol. Notice that I'll be able to pull the trigger and you can hear the magazine cycling through. So we know that there were no pellets in there that were too long or jamming the gun up because the magazine was able to cycle with all the pellets in the magazine. Now let's look at examples of pellets that will not cycle in any rotary magazines. With the exception of the blue arrow, none of the jacketed pellets will cycle in any rotary magazines. That includes the hypervelocity / fast flights, Goldenrod / Penetrators, and Gamo Lethals. All of these pellets are simply too long to cycle in any rotary magazines, whether it's a pistol or a rifle. Pellets such as the Blue Flame, Red Fire, or Predator Polymag will also not cycle in any rotary magazines. If the polymer tip was removed, the pellets would be short enough to cycle in any magazine, but that polymer insert makes the pellet too long to cycle. Notice how each of the pellets is too long and will prevent the magazine from turning. I've taken out all the pellets except one, and now I'll be loading this one into the chamber. Now after I chamber it, watch what happens, or listen what happens when I pull the trigger. The pellet's so long that it actually makes it difficult to chamber the magazine itself. Alright, it's chambered. Now, as I try to pull the trigger, it won't, because the magazine inside will not index. It won't cycle. It can't turn because the pellet is too long and it got in the way. As you can see, the magazine hasn't moved at all. The last category is pellets that are in the weird gray zone where they'll cycle in some magazines but not in others. These pellets by Gamo, the PBA Bullet, Airstar, and Luxor CU are at the very upper limit of what the Gamo Swarm's magazine can handle. Once these are loaded into a Gamo Swarm magazine, there is no clearance at all between the pellet and the wall of the magazine. You can see here that they would not be able to cycle in my air pistol. So for these pellets, it really depends on the model of the gun. Here's another interesting example of a pellet that is picky about the gun it's fired out of. This is an ultra heavy Magnum 22 caliber pellet that I cast myself. It's based on the H&N Rabbit Magnum pellet, and with these, it's not the length that causes cycling issues. It's the difficulty of getting it into the chamber. This pellet can fit into any rotary magazine with no issue. It just won't chamber in the Gamo Swarm, whether it's the Maxim or Magnum. Because it's shaped like a bullet, it needs more force to be pushed into the chamber than a regular pellet does, and the indexing system in the Gamo Swarms just don't have the force needed to push them into the chamber. So what ends up happening is the pellet only makes it halfway into the chamber, but you won't be able to close the barrel back up. So if you're shooting a multi-shot underlevel rifle or a bolt action PCP, you can use your own physical strength to make the action force the pellet into the chamber. But if you're using an indexing magazine like this one here for the Gamo Swarm, let me get the angle back there. Like this one for the Gamo Swarm. The system that the Swarm uses just doesn't have the force to push this pellet into the chamber. So there you have it. Most of the common shaped pellets that aren't especially long will cycle in rotary magazines, while some of the slightly longer pellets will cycle in some, but not in others. The really long and oddly shaped pellets won't cycle in any of the rotary magazines, and they have to be fired single shot. These aren't all the different types of pellets out there, but hopefully this helped explain which pellets do cycle in repeating air guns and which ones don't. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video, like it if you did, and check out my channel if airguns are your thing, and thanks for watching.